Good evening and welcome to NTD Business. I'm Paul Graney. The U.S. economy is recovering, but slowly. We talked to Joseph Trevisani at FX Street about whether we should allow it to recover itself instead of another round of a stimulus package. U.S. Airlines begin to furlough tens of thousands of workers as payroll support expires. The White House's newest stimulus proposal gives airlines a $20 billion extension. The Justice Department charges hundreds of people for healthcare fraud and opioid crimes. Authorities call it the largest healthcare fraud takedown in U.S. history. Now we talked to Daniel Akaya about bailing out the airline industry. We ask him if it's worth it. Lots of economic figures out today. We'll try our best to break it down for you. Unemployment claims beat expectations, a welcome piece of news after a pretty underwhelming month for unemployment. Continuing claims fell by 1 million to 11.8 million as the total number of people on unemployment. That data is delayed by a week. And less people filed for the first time last week compared to the week before. 837,000 last week versus 870,000 the week before. So 36,000 less. Still quite high though. And despite all the unemployment, personal and household income remained very high during the pandemic. That's thanks to government and central bank stimulus. Household income was 2% higher in August than February before the pandemic. It's because of enhanced unemployment, a stimulus-fueled stock market rally, and stimulus checks. But it is starting to slow. Personal income slowed between July and August, down 2.7%. Commerce Department says it was mostly down to enhanced unemployment starting to run out. And of course, some people have benefited from the stimulus more than others. It's something we've covered on this show and something we will continue to cover. But regardless, Congress and the White House are confident we'll see another package before the election. The Treasury Secretary said today that it will include more stimulus checks for Americans. Here's the details.
Mnuchin told Fox News that Democrats and White House negotiators have agreed on a range of measures, including direct relief payments, but a final deal hasn't been reached yet.
So the good news is we have reached an agreement that if there is a deal, there are direct payments similar to last time that are in the package.
The first round of stimulus payments under the CARES Act were $1,200 per adult. That was for people who made under $75,000 a year. For married couples, the threshold was $150,000. They were eligible for $24,000 per couple and $500 per dependent child under 18. Besides the direct payments, Mnuchin said the two sides also see eye to eye on more funding for small businesses, aid to airlines, money for schools so they can safely reopen, and funds for testing and vaccines.
And the question we always like to ask here is, do we really need another stimulus package? It's of course good to stimulate the economy, but I saw this graph in the Wall Street Journal. If you look at the end of it, it seems to show that personal income and spending are starting to normalize. I wondered, should we just allow things to fix themselves instead of disconnecting things from reality again, which we saw with the pandemic and the economy all through this year? I asked Joseph Trevisani that. He's a senior analyst at FX Street.
One of the problems is you have an abnormal economy. No economy, certainly no modern economy, has ever gone through what we just, or the rest of the world just went through. So there are still enormous numbers of people being laid off. We have almost 1 million people being laid off every week. That impacts spending. There's no way around it. We have people who are partially employed and people who are worried about their jobs, and so their tendency is to spend less. But as we know, with consumer spending about 70% of the income, one of the most dangerous things that could happen is you get a contracting cycle in consumer spending, because that will exacerbate what's going on because in the labor market because of the remains of the pandemic. So in this case, I would say no, another stimulus package is still needed, and it will help to supposedly tide the economy over to normality. When normality strikes, nobody's really sure.
And does it make it more difficult for analysts like yourself and even policymakers to get a grasp of how the fundamentals are and how the economy itself is actually performing?
That's completely right. It makes it very difficult. If you remember back in March and April, when we were looking at those enormous layoffs and the enormous drops in non-farm payrolls, almost universally, analysts expected those to continue into May. I believe the consensus estimate was for 8 million more jobs to be lost in May. What happened, though, is the economy reversed. It produced 2.7 jobs. Well, that's a swing of almost 10 million jobs. So it does make it extremely difficult because models work basically on applying what happens in the past to the future. There is no model that we can go to tell us what's going to happen in an economy when you shed 22 million jobs and then bring back 10 million jobs in the space of 2 quarters.
And I asked you this question just, I think, a couple of weeks ago when we were last speaking about the stimulus package. I thought it was all behind us finally, but it's back again. There's talk about they might reach a deal. What are your thoughts now?
I think I've been of two minds of this one because normally if there were no presidential, if there's not a presidential election, I would say the stimulus would go through. Each side would argue for the things that they want. They would try to throw in a few extras along the lines of their own particular desires, but they would pass one. I think now the presidential election complicates it because the better the economy performs, and stimulus by every measure supports the economy, it supports spending, it supports jobs, it supports consumer outlook, benefits the incumbent, benefits Donald Trump's reelection campaign. So I can see why the Democrats might be reluctant to sign one in time so that the economic effects would be felt across the country. I don't think they will want to not sign one at all, because that would be something where they would appear to be putting their party interests ahead of the country. So I think we'll get one, but it will be now, perhaps, or closer to the election, so that the economic effects are diminished.
I see, yeah. We'll keep an eye on it anyway. I'm not so sure myself. Joseph, appreciate it. Thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Have a good day.
Part of the stimulus package is, of course, a bailout for airlines. It would give airlines a 6-month aid extension at a cost of billions of dollars. It comes as airlines begin to furlough thousands of workers this week.
White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows says their new stimulus proposal is worth over $1.5 trillion. It includes a $20 billion extension in aid to the airline industry. It comes as the federal payroll support program expires and airlines are looking for a lifeline. Two of America's largest airlines, American and United, have started furloughing over 32,000 workers. On Wednesday, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin urged them to delay the furlough if a bipartisan deal was in sight. It's a stressful time for workers in the industry.
I mean, I don't know how to feel right now. Do I feel sad? Do I feel scared? Do I feel angry and frustrated? There's so many emotions that are pulsing through my veins and through the veins of 8,000 other American Airlines flight attendants. Congress
and the White House have been considering a second round of airline aid for weeks, but it's hung up with the stimulus package.
We're hoping for a counter proposal and for a possible stimulus bill to get passed, or at least serious negotiations to be signaled.
Talks are set to continue between Mnuchin and Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. American and United say they will reverse the furloughs if Congress reaches a deal soon and extends payroll support.
Of course, saving jobs is always a good thing, but it comes at the taxpayers' expense. Airlines have already received massive bailouts in recent years, so is it wise to keep giving them more without structural reforms and maybe some guarantees? One colleague I spoke with today said it might cost the taxpayer, but it'll help the economy recover. Without air travel, there's simply no recovery. I asked Daniel Akaya that question. He's the author of Escape the Central Bank Trap.
It's a difficult decision, but what you need to do is the following. The first thing is to understand that most of these airlines have no problem whatsoever in finding cheap financing and in getting equity in the equity markets with a good restructuring program, and that is critical. So what you need to do is to help these companies send a message to markets that it's a good investment to refinance their bonds and to recapitalize the company. That is crucial. You cannot just say, oh, it's the COVID-19 crisis and we'll just let money drain out of the company for another 3 to 4 years. The second thing you need to do is that if government wants to support the companies for a short period of time, it has to be done similar to the TARP program that was given to the banks, i.e., in a way in which the money that is provided to the companies is utilized in the most efficient way and is returned with interests or via dividends or via periodic payments. So I think that those two things are critical. On one side, you need to put competitiveness, efficiency, and improvement of the structural problems of the airline companies, each of them individually, and of the airline sector in itself, because the airline sector cannot continue to be a sector that is in a race to zero, in which it constantly is driving profitability away out of the sector in order to achieve a level of market share that it never gets, and worse of all, makes the companies less efficient and weaker. So what the government needs to do is those two things. First, incentivize companies to recapitalize themselves and to refinance themselves quickly in the markets. There's plenty of liquidity for that. Second is that if there is any type of support, that support has to come with a number of conditions, which have to come via a return on through dividends or through periodic payments.
Daniel, appreciate your time as always. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
And discussion on this round of stimulus seems to have gone on for pretty much forever. But the Congress didn't need as much discussion on the rescue package for the government. President Trump signed a stopgap spending bill early today to avoid a federal government shutdown. It'll keep the government open through December 11th. The bill maintains current funding levels for most programs, and it gives lawmakers more time to work out budget details for the new fiscal year. That includes for military operations, health care, national parks, space programs, and airport and border security. The Senate approved the bill on Wednesday in a bipartisan vote. The House approved it late last week after reaching a deal with the White House. And in other news, authorities have announced what they're calling the largest health care fraud and opioid takedown in U.S. history. It's worth $6 billion. Hundreds of defendants have been charged.
The Department of Justice announced charges against almost 350 people across more than 50 federal districts on Wednesday. They're accused of having allegedly submitted billions of dollars in fraudulent healthcare claims. Among the defendants are more than 100 doctors, nurses, and other licensed medical professionals. Authorities call it the largest healthcare fraud and opioid takedown in U.S. history. The defendants were charged with having submitted in excess of $6 billion in false and fraudulent claims to federal healthcare programs and private insurers. The majority of the alleged losses are related to schemes connected to telemedicine. That's the use of technology to provide healthcare services remotely. Those losses comprise almost $5 billion in false and fraudulent claims made by almost 90 defendants in around 20 federal districts. The remainder of the alleged losses related to false and fraudulent claims are connected to substance abuse treatment facilities, also known as sober homes.
We asked fraud expert Frank McKenna who the scammers are targeting. We also asked how they were able to do it on such a large scale.
Yeah, so these scammers really took advantage of vulnerable populations. So that's how they committed the fraud. They went after elderly people, people that were on Medicare, people that were on Medicaid, and even people that had drug addictions like opioid addictions. So they really targeted vulnerable populations. And what they would do is do advertisements on the internet. They would send out robocalls to people, and they would do pop-up messages. And in all of these occurrences, what they were doing is offering either free medical devices or free prescriptions, so to entice these people to call. These people would call with a call center, which was often overseas, and the person on the other end of the line would then transfer them to a real doctor or somebody purporting to be a doctor and do a short consultation. And at the end of that consultation, the doctor would often prescribe things that the victim never needed, things like back braces or knee braces or prescriptions for drugs they didn't need. And then they would charge Medicare, Medicaid, and the U.S. government hundreds and thousands of dollars for these items that the victim never needed. So we know there's been a doubling of scams worldwide because people are isolated, people are in their homes, they're more susceptible to fraud. And if you are a scammer or a fraudster that's engaging in this, you should be very nervous because the U.S. government is targeting this scam in particular. They're out there now, they're investigating frauds, and you will hear more about these frauds in the next 12 to 18 months.
All three major U.S. indexes closed higher on Thursday. The Nasdaq in the lead and the Dow seeing just the smallest gain. S&P 500 and the Nasdaq were boosted by tech stocks again, including Amazon, Microsoft, Apple. The real estate sector gained the most, though, this incredible housing rally and boom, while energy companies were down over 3%. The Dow rose 35.2 points or 0.13%. S&P 500 gained 17.8 points or 0.53%. The Nasdaq added 159 points or 1.42%. And in European news, the EU is taking legal action against the UK over its internal market bill. Brussels claims the UK is breaching good faith agreement, while the UK says it's trying to preserve the integrity of trade within its own borders.
The EU has started legal action against the UK over its plan to breach the Brexit agreement and international law. Upon the news, the pound dropped 0.7%.
This draft bill is, by its very nature, a breach of the obligation of good faith laid down in the withdrawal agreement. Moreover, if adopted as is, it will be in full contradiction to the Protocol of Ireland, Northern Ireland.
The legal move could eventually lead to a case in the European Court of Justice. The British government confirmed they would respond to the request in due course. The new internal market bill introduced by the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is seen as controversial among other Conservative members. It puts the UK, though, at loggerheads with its biggest trading partner, the EU. In the worst-case scenario, the EU could block trading between the two partners. Separately, the EU-UK trade deal now goes into a critical phase of negotiations with the mid-October deadline looming. EU Brexit chief negotiator Michael Barnier tweeted on Monday, "The full and effective implementation of the withdrawal agreement will always be an absolute priority for the EU."
And still to come this evening, President Trump signs a rare earths executive order. It's his latest bid to end China's dominance in the industry. And the United States blocks palm oil from one of Malaysia's largest producers. The ban follows recent investigations that say the company uses forced labor. That and more after the break. Welcome back. President Trump has issued a new executive order on rare earth mining. It directs his cabinet to look into the United States' reliance on critical mineral imports from other countries. Rare earth minerals are used in a wide range of products: airplanes, computers, cell phones, electric power networks, and advanced electronics. The order said America's dependence on foreign adversaries for critical minerals poses a threat, and the reliance on China is particularly concerning. The U.S. imports 80% of rare earth elements directly from China. Agencies will have to come up with strategies to address the threat within 60 days. That could mean tariffs, quotas, or other import restrictions against China and other non-market rivals. It also directs agencies to find ways to support domestic production. The United States used to be the leading producer of rare earth metals, but China has used aggressive tactics to flood the market and squeeze out its competitors. And several Republican lawmakers have introduced a new bill. It aims to stop U.S. investment from going to entities with ties to the Chinese regime. If the bill is passed, the SEC may require financial institutions to disclose investment in certain Chinese-linked companies. These companies are on the U.S. entity list. They're seen as a threat to U.S. national security. Currently, more than 300 Chinese companies are on the list, including telecom giant Huawei and its affiliates. And the United States has blocked a major palm oil producer in Malaysia. It's over concerns about forced labor and human rights abuses. But the company says the ban is based on old news and that it's already taken steps to correct the problem.
The US is blocking shipments of palm oil from major Malaysian producer FGV. US authorities found indications of forced labor, including concerns about child workers along with physical and sexual abuse.
One of the things that we're seeing in the US is more and more interest in combating this type of situation. And the way to do it is simply by keeping the products that are made with this labor out of the United States.
The order against FGV Holdings Berhad went into effect Wednesday. It's one of Malaysia's largest palm oil companies. It's part of the supply chains of some of the most iconic food and cosmetic companies like Unilever, L'Oreal, Nestle and Procter & Gamble. DeBusk says international companies are focusing more on their supply chains because of forced labor concerns.
If in fact they don't do due diligence and they've been put on notice that there's a problem with palm oil, then the companies that are using this palm oil could face significant legal liability themselves.
The action was triggered by a petition filed last year by non-profit organisations. FGV vowed to clear its name. It said the allegations have been publicly available since 2015 and they've taken steps to correct it. But a recent AP investigation suggests the issues are still happening. Malaysia is the world's second largest producer of palm oil. Global production of palm oil has soared from 5 million tonnes in 1999 to currently 72 million tonnes. DeBusk says it's now up to the palm oil producer to convince the US that they should lift the order. She expects that will be a slow process.
And officials say the U.S. and Taiwan will work together on infrastructure projects in the Indo-Pacific region and Latin America. It's an implicit pushback against China's Belt and Road investment plans.
U.S. and Taiwan officials made the infrastructure announcement on Wednesday. Washington sees Beijing's Belt and Road initiative as a plan to entrap countries with debt diplomacy. The de facto U.S. Embassy in Taipei said the new plan would promote more resilient supply chains in the Indo-Pacific region.
We will also work hard to cooperate with Taiwan and other economies with similar ideologies to promote the reorganization of the supply chain in the Indo-Pacific region.
Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu said it would support investment in infrastructure in the region.
Through cooperation between the public and private sectors of Taiwan and the United States to help those countries in the region to develop their energy industry and infrastructure.
The plan sets up a working group led by the U.S. Treasury Department and Taiwan's Finance Ministry. It will hold its first meeting this autumn. The U.S. and Taiwan said that they are seeking allies to work together and shift their global supply chains from China. The plan also fits Taiwan's new southbound policy. The island is working to boost economic ties with Southeast and South Asia, but cut reliance on China.
And still to come this evening, the multi-billion-dollar clothing recycling industry is facing a crisis. The supply chain is breaking down and clothes are piling up. Find out more after the break. Welcome back. Clothing recycling is called the pressure release valve of fast fashion. But this year's donations are piling up and the second-hand clothing market is breaking down.
There's a multi-billion-dollar global trade in second-hand clothing and recycled clothes which helps keep it out of landfill, while keeping the wardrobes of the fashion-savvy clear for next season's designs. Now though, because of the pandemic, exporters, traders and customers who rely on a steady supply of used clothes are struggling. It's not that there isn't enough clothes, ironically there's too many, which has plummeted their value and led to huge backlogs in warehouses and thrift shops. And it's often those in poorer nations who are hit hardest. It's an issue Antonio Di Cavalho knows all too well, as the boss at a British textile recycling firm.
We keep going. But we couldn't sell any clothes during this lockdown. So the second-hand market in Europe and the rest of the world collapsed.
Recyclers and exporters have had to cut their prices to shift stock, as lockdown measures restrict movement and business slows in end markets abroad. For many, it's no longer commercially viable They simply can't afford to move the merchandise. Meanwhile, recyclers are also removing clothes banks from streets, reducing collections and laying off workers to conserve cash, while stuck-at-home consumers clear out their wardrobes, adding to the pile-up. In the United States, for example, the value of exports from March to July fell 45% compared with the same period last year, so says government data. Up to a third of clothes donated in the US ends up for sale in markets in the developing world.
And that's all the business updates for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.